Let's bring in Dave Penman now. He's General Secretary of the FDA Union, which represents civil servants. Dave, thanks for joining me this morning. Now, what do you make of Dominic Raab's claims about collusion? He said that he thinks that there was certainly some coordination. One of the complaints was struck out because they'd written it together. It does say in Adam Tolley's report that some of those who complained about Dominic Raab's behaviour hadn't even worked directly with him.
Yes, it's interesting. Dominic Raab didn't make any of those assertions when he met with Adam Tolley. Indeed, Adam Tolley says that the Prime Minister accepted that there was no collusion, that complaints had been made in good faith, and indeed that there was no snowflake culture. So all of this is just sour grapes from Dominic Raab after the event. He's been found to have bullied civil servants, to have humiliated them, to be aggressive. He doesn't like that. He seems to want to pick and choose which bits of the Tolley report he likes. He likes the bit where the complaints were dismissed, and then he doesn't like the bit where the complaints found that he bullied civil servants. So it's just all sour grapes post the report from Raab.
But having said that, Dave, compared to some of the reports in the newspapers, and we can speak about whether there should be a leak inquiry, there were calls about him shouting and swearing, that apparently at one point he'd thrown tomatoes at staff. Pardon the expression, but none of that actually stuck. And what he's been found guilty of is a pretty low bar on bullying, you'd agree, surely?
No, I wouldn't agree, because Adam Tolley's a KC and he's had to look at what bullying is. You know, if you look at some of the words that Tolley's used in his report about humiliating people, about aggression, about deliberately targeting an individual, about being aggressive and how he conducted himself and being deliberate about it, I don't think that that's a low bar. I mean, ultimately, the Prime Minister is actually the arbiter of this. Adam Tolley was only asked to establish the facts. The Prime Minister's independent advisor was not involved in this, as far as we know, and therefore it was the Prime Minister who had to look at this and decide whether, in light of the evidence, it satisfied any definition of bullying. So again, I do not believe there is a low bar here. I think what you've got is Dominic Raab, who was absolutely convinced of his own position. The report makes clear time and again he had an opportunity to amend his behaviour, and actually says in the report the only time he changed his conduct was after complaints went in, and that he should have amended his conduct beforehand.
But at the time,
sorry, when you go.
But at the time, Dave Penman, the report does make it clear that he wasn't alerted to some people finding his behaviour uncomfortable. But just on that point about a robust process,
I mean,
as a union man,
Philip Barton and Antonio Romeo raised with him his conduct. Antonio Romeo raised issues about his conduct on 3 separate occasions. And actually, if you look at what it says about his interaction with Philip Barton, it says that Dominic Raab denied that this took place, and Adam Tolley believes Philip Barton and not Dominic Raab.
But doesn't that come to the nub of this issue, in that this is a he said, she said process? You're a union man. You wouldn't want one of your members to be accused of something without the witnesses actually being cross-examined. But in this investigation, they weren't.
Well, the witnesses were interviewed. They're not cross-examined. This is not a criminal case. There's no cross-examination of witnesses in a bullying investigation in any other employer. That's not how it works. What happens is an investigator has to look at evidence. Quite often, this is evidence when you look at harassment and bullying that is about individuals. And you look at that, and in balance of probabilities, you say, do I believe that person or that person if there's no independent evidence? That's entirely reasonable. That's also the law of the land just now. So if you look at what happened in relation to the interaction with Sir Philip Barton, what they've looked at, Adam Tolley's looked at, what did the Prime Minister say? What did Philip Barton say? Which one stands up to greater scrutiny, and found that actually it was Sir Philip Barton's evidence that stood up to greater scrutiny. He denied that Antonio Romeo had raised any issues with him, yet she had contemporaneous notes describing the interactions and the evidence she'd given. So you have to find a way of establishing believing one witness versus another.
OK, let's just address this specific point about the FDA. Let me just quote what Raab has said yesterday. Also, I know that I was warned by a very senior member of the government, a senior civil servant, that there are increasingly activist civil servants mobilised by the FDA Union who are looking to target ministers. Is that true, Mr. Penman?
It's laughable, to be honest, at the fact that he's making that accusation. If only we had such power as a trade union, to be honest. But thanks very much for the name check, Dominic. We weren't involved in the majority of these complaints. We had no involvement in a significant number of them. We do not target ministers. We represent our members. And if you look at it, if that's the case, what have we actually seen? In the last 5 years, there's only been 2 formal complaints against ministers. Both have actually been found in favour of the complainants. That's against Priti Patel and now against Dominic Raab. So if there's somehow this activist culture, how is it actually manifesting itself? There is no evidence for this. Once again, simply sour grapes.
Well, it might be manifesting itself in, for instance, Sue Gray deciding to go and be Chief of Staff for Sir Keir Starmer. Don't you think that's undermined people's opinions of whether the civil service is in fact impartial?
Well, I think, as Jonathan Ashworth said earlier on, the civil service has people who work for it impartially and can then go on and do jobs working for different political parties, including the Conservative Party. It's about what you do when you're a civil servant. You're free to choose another employer at a different point in time. And some people, that will be a company, a big business, private sector. And some people, because of the nature of what they do, they're interested in politics, they will go on to work for a political party. There are plenty of civil servants who are currently working for the former civil servants who are working for the Conservative Party. So are we going to ban all civil servants from ever getting a job with a political party? If that's the case, that's fine, but it applies equally to everyone. And I don't really see how it's relevant to anything to do with Dominic Raab.
Final question. Is it right that there are some government departments, considering everything that's going on with the country at the moment, in the sense perhaps that Britain isn't working, that there are some departments where there's only a 39% turnout in the office, that 2/3 of those departments are still working at home all these years on from the pandemic?
So the civil service before the pandemic decided that it was more efficient to have less desks than they have people. So they reduced the civil service estate. So before anything happened on COVID, civil servants were routinely working from home. Nobody raised a question about whether that was effective or not. And since the pandemic, the government have insisted that civil servants come in for at least 2 days a week. What you're looking at is occupancy figures for a particular day. If every civil service turned up to Whitehall, we considered this at one point, actually, given the criticism. We'll say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll ask all civil servants to turn up at their work and see if they've got a desk. They wouldn't have one. So the government's decided to save taxpayers' money and say that there's flexible working, and that's good for civil servants and it's good for the economy and good for the taxpayer.